So thank you very much, Johanna, for your nice introduction. And in the following about 30 minutes, we will really try to elaborate on a basic understanding of how sonography will actually work. And I actually do hope that after having listened to this lecture, you will have a good ground base for the upcoming days. But before I actually want to start about sonography, we're going to make a trip into the animal kingdom and talk about bats. Because the way bats will navigate will really help us in understanding how ultrasound works. So basically, everything a bat does is it produces a high-pitched vocal sound with its vocal cords, and then this high-pitched sound will travel through the air until it will eventually meet an object. It will bounce off this object and then travel back as an echo. And everything a bat does is counting the time between the emission of the wave and the reception of an echo. And by counting the time, it can not only calculate the distance to the object, but also the size of the object, the shape of the object, and even the direction the object is heading to. So in case of sonography, we really don't have any bats sitting in our transducers, but we rather rely on crystals. Those crystals have two main properties, and they are very useful for sonography. So the first property will be that if we apply some electrical potential to the crystal, it will generate an ultrasound wave. And the second property is that if the crystal will face mechanical stress, it will then produce an electrical potential. And what we are going to do in the upcoming minutes is we are producing a sonographic picture by ourselves. And the first thing we will do is actually we apply some electrical potential to the crystal. And the crystal will now produce this ultrasound wave, which will travel through the body. It will eventually get reflected at an interface. And then it will travel back to the crystal as an echo. And now the crystal will generate some electrical potential. And by now we know that it's basically just the sending process of an ultrasound wave and the reception of an echo. But I have also talked about interfaces, and if we forget about all the physics behind it, you just have to keep in mind that an interface will be all those regions where tissues with different properties will meet. So there will be interfaces throughout our body. And what we keep in mind is that the higher the mismatch in tissue properties will be, the higher will be the reflection. And the more the tissues will resemble, the lower will be the reflection. So if we're reviewing this process, we are seeing a video, and we are seeing that we are in a constant cycle of emission of waves and reception of an echo. And the ultrasound wave will maybe encounter our first interface. It will generate an echo, and then it will encounter a second interface where it will generate an echo. And again, like the bat, everything an ultrasound machine does is counting the time between the emission of the wave and the reception of an echo. And what we're going to do now is we're going to transform this electrical potential we acquired with the crystals to transform it into a picture. And the first mode we can display our pictures with is the so-called brightness mode. The B mode depicts tissues, and it's actually, I think, the mode you know if we are talking about sonography. So what will happen is that we will assign every amplitude of an echo a different color. And the higher the amplitude of an echo is, the brighter it will appear in a screen. So for example, we are seeing a very, very bright structure at that place, and that is just a creation of a really, really high amplitude echo. And if there is a tissue that will not generate any echo at all, we will just display it as black. If it's somewhere in between, so we will generate a low amplitude echo, we will display the picture or the tissue as gray. But actually, I don't really want to talk about black and white and gray, because as we are scanning, we don't really examine the color of our organs, but we are rather examining the echo texture of an organ. So we are scanning the ability of an organ to generate an echo. That's why we will call all those gray structures hypoechoic. So they will generate a little echo. We will assign all those really bright structure the term hyperechoic. And if there is no echo at all, we will just say it's anechoic, so it's producing no echo. And what we keep in mind till now is that bones and air, they will be hyperechoic. All the soft tissues will generally be hypoechoic. And fluid, it will absorb the ultrasound waves, but it will not generate any echo. It will be plaque. And sometimes we really want to compare the echo structures of two organs. And so if they resemble quite a lot, we just tell that they are isoechoic. And the next mode I'm going to talk about is the M mode. And the M mode is really difficult for many people to understand. So we're going to take a different approach. Imagine you're a sailor and you're on a ship. The ship is anchoring, so you are not moving. And then there is a whale. The whale is swimming in the sea, and it's actually passing below the ship. And then you're the sailor, and then you think, oh, it would be great to actually look what happens below my ship. But I unfortunately only have a camera. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this camera directly below our ship, and we will just take a lot of pictures, and the camera will stay in place. So what will happen now is that the camera stays at this place, but with a very high frequency, we are going to take a picture of the same place. What will happen now is that the whale will actually swim below our ship, but we are having a depiction of the motion in relation to time. And that's actually what an M mode does. So in sonography, we would just have a random P picture. In that case, that would be our mitral valve in the heart. And then we're actually taking a line, and we want to examine the movement of a structure at this specific line. And what we are going to do is take a lot of pictures and assign these pictures in a row. And so we are having a different mode in which we really can analyze movement really, really well. That is called the M mode. In that case, we're seeing the movement of the mitral valve. And at the beginning, it's really hard for beginners to understand. But if you just take the approach that we will display the movement of a structure, that should be fine for now. So now we have talked about how to generate a picture, which modes we can actually use. But there is still one more point I really want to talk about, and that's frequencies. So as we are scanning, we have to have transducers, and there is a wide variety of transducers, and we always have to choose the appropriate one. And the transducers, they will vary not only in their shape and in their size, but also in their frequency. And something we have to keep in mind is that high frequencies will result in a really, really good resolution, and that low frequency probes will result in a relatively bad resolution. But as a drawback, high frequency probes will have a very, very low penetration depth, so they will get attenuated really relatively quickly. And low frequency probes, as an advantage, have a very, very deep penetration depth. So what ultrasound is basically about is that we always have to find this compromise between penetration depth and between resolution. As now we're going to talk about the three most important arrays we will use in the upcoming days. It's the phased array, the curved array, and the linear array. And as I told you, they will not only vary in their shape, but also in their frequencies. So the first one is the phased array. It produces kind of a slice of pie-shaped image. We're having the curved array, which will produce a trapezoidal field of view. And we're having the linear array, which will produce a rectangular field of view. So first of all, let's talk about the linear array. It's pretty easy to understand. And in the linear array, we're having our crystals aligned in one row. And those crystals, they will emit the ultrasound waves. They will travel through the tissue. And the major plus of the linear array is that we are having a beam density that is linear throughout. And also, linear frequency probes tend to be high frequency probes. That's why we will have a really, really good resolution, axially as well as laterally. And this will help us in really examining small parts, in examining arteries, veins, the thyroid glands, muscles, or even the pleura. And maybe tomorrow you will hear a lot about pleura evaluation with sonography. So I think you should keep that probe in mind. The second probe we're going to talk about is the phased array. Imagine you want to scan the heart, but really the ribs are in our way. And I have to tell you that bones and air, it's not really made for ultrasound. So we really want to avoid the bones. And if you think of your ribs and then think of your intercostal spaces, you will realize that your intercostal spaces are pretty narrow. But still you want to get a good picture of our organs. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this small phased array, and we have a really, really small focus zone. But what we're going to do is that the focus zone will constantly change its position. And as it's changing its position in a cycle, we are getting this slice of pie-shaped image, which is very, very useful, because at the superficial area of the picture, where there is the intercostal areas, and we don't really want to examine that, the field of view will be really, really narrow. But as we are scanning the heart, and as the penetration depth increases, our field of view is getting wider. And so it's really, really, really useful in examining the heart, for example. And in the upcoming days, we will need it for the rush evaluation of the heart. The last array I'm going to talk about is the curved array. So the curved array is somehow a compromise between the linear array and the phased array. It has these piezoelectrical crystals aligned on a curvilinear surface. And as the ultrasound waves get injected, they will diverge. And the deeper the penetration depth of the picture will be, the more the ultrasound beam will diverge. And that leads to a really, really low, so I'm not seeing the pointer. Right now we're seeing the pointer. And what we're seeing is a very, very low lateral resolution as we're going deeper into our body. But imagine you're scanning the typical Austrian. So the typical Austrian, if we're scanning the abdomen, he will have quite an amount of belly fat. And so if we want to do ultrasound, first of all, we have to parse a lot of fat. And that's why we will need a low frequency probe with a wide field of view as we are penetrating the tissue. That's why the curved array will be especially useful for the evaluation of the abdomen. The last theoretical point I want to talk about are artifacts. Because if you think of artifacts, you will think they're a nuisance, but that's not totally true in sonography. In reality, in sonography, artifacts will be a very, very valuable diagnostic tool and aid, at least most of the time. And so I first of all want to define what artifacts are. So artifacts are images that do not actually represent the tissues being scanned. And they arise from a variety of different phenomena, such as reflection, absorption, acoustic scattering, and reflection. But I don't want to talk about physics. What we just keep in mind is that they do depict reality. So sometimes it might be really, really hard for us to actually distinguish reality from an artifact. And so what we're going to keep in mind is that artifacts, they will shift their position as we are moving the probe. And real structures will not change their position in our body only because we move our probes. So try to keep that in mind for the upcoming days. And now I want to talk about 4 specific artifacts which seem very important for me the upcoming days. So the first one is posterior acoustic enhancement. And what we are seeing is we are having some fluid-filled structures. We know it's fluid-filled because it's anechoic. And then behind those fluid-filled structures, we have a relatively hyperechoic zone. And it's called acoustic enhancement. But in reality, the ultrasound wave will not really get enhanced. Instead, it will get less absorbed. And as it's traveling through the fluid-filled cysts, for example, it will not get absorbed, it will not get attenuated, and that's why it will have lots of energy behind the structure and will appear relatively bright. That's a very, very valuable diagnostic tool because it can lead us to the differential diagnosis of fluid-filled cysts or vessels and so forth from other structures. However, that's not 100% specific because lymphomas or even hepatocellular carcinomas would always or sometimes even do that. The next artifact is acoustic shadowing. So imagine you're sending this ultrasound beam through tissue. It will eventually encounter a stone, for example, or a bone, or air. So what will happen now is that all the energy that is encountering the stone, the bone, or the air will either get reflected or it will get absorbed. And so, as all the energy is getting absorbed or reflected, there will really be no energy that is passing through the stone. And if there is no energy, we can create no echo. And that's why behind those structures that will generate a lot of reflectivity or a lot of absorption, so we will have anechoic regions. And this can be really, really helpful as well in diagnosis. For example, we are thinking of the liver here, and that will be the gallbladder. And then we are having some structures here. They seem pretty heterogeneously. And so our differential diagnosis, maybe it's polyps, maybe it's a tumor, maybe it's a stone. But in that case, we are having acoustic shadowing. And so acoustic shadowing would be, in that case, really pathognomonic for gallstones. The next artifact is reverberations. So sometimes, if we are sending out an ultrasound beam through the tissue, it will eventually encounter a strong parallel reflector. And what it does now is that it will get reflected and travel back and forth between the transducer and the first strong parallel reflector. However, the ultrasound transducer does not really know that the ultrasound beam is only traveling back and forth. So what it does is creating these equally distant parallel lines that are getting less energetic the deeper it will be displayed on the screen. Those reverberation artifacts, which will look like this in reality, are really, really helpful. For example, if we're scanning the lungs. So we will talk about that on Sunday as well. And then there is one last artifact which seems very, very important to me. So sometimes we're sending out an ultrasound beam and it travels through the tissue, and then we are having an oblique structure. And this structure will have a high reflectivity, for example, the diaphragm. So what we are doing now is the ultrasound beam travels to the diaphragm, but it will not get reflected, but rather it will get refracted, and it will change its direction of propagation. It will travel through the tissue. It will finally encounter a nodular structure, for example, be reflected again, and then travel back to the ultrasound transducer. However, the ultrasound machine does not really know that the ultrasound beam is getting refracted, but the only thing it realizes is, the echo is returning relatively late, so it must be a deep structure. And the result of that is the so-called mirror imaging artifact. So in case we are having an oblique structure that has a high reflectivity, we will create a mirror image. In that case, that will be the real liver, and we are having a nodule here. And what we are seeing is somehow a mirror image of the liver, and we can even see the nodular structure. So in that case, that would also be not only a nuisance, but it will be very, very helpful, but we will talk about it tomorrow. And so I think everything you have to know is that the mirror imaging artifact will occur, for example, as we are scanning the right costodiaphragmal angle. Now, I've talked a lot about fiery, but still we want to be a little practical, at least. And imagine this bluish structure will be an organ. So basically, ultrasound is a cross-sectional imaging technique. So all we're going to do is we're creating gross sections. But ultrasound is really, really cool, because unlike a computer tomography, where we can only generate those transverse cross sections, we can just create any cross section we want with ultrasound, as long as we have the acoustic window. And that's what makes ultrasound so special, because we can really generate this three-dimensional image and depiction of an inner organ and even a pathology. And now we have talked that ultrasound is a scanning technique that makes cross sections, but still we don't really know how to use an ultrasound machine. So we would look at an ultrasound machine, and right now maybe you think, how the heck will I ever be able to work with that? There are just so many knobs. I would not remember that. But if you're thinking of watching TV, and you have a TV remote, there will be a lot of buttons, but you won't really use them. There would maybe be like 4 or 5 or even 6 buttons you would use on a regular basis. And that's why there is an ultrasound TV remote. It's more like the Apple version of an ultrasound TV remote. So we are having 5 buttons you will really have to know in the upcoming days. We have talked about M mode, we have talked about the B mode, so I won't cover that. But imagine you're scanning and you're searching for the kidneys and you just don't find them. But eventually you're finding the kidney. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to press the freeze button, because then you're safe to analyze the picture in freedom. You can't lose the structure again, and it will really ease your level of stress in that case. The next point is we want to talk about depth. So it's not working. It's not working. So we're just waiting a little. And I just talk about it anyway. So in ultrasound, you can always adapt the penetration depth of tissue. So if you want to scan an organ that is pretty superficial, you won't really need 20 centimeters penetration depth. So if you're scanning a thyroid gland, maybe 5. Okay, it's not working anymore. Maybe there is a solution. Kannst du weiterschalten? Dann schaltest du einfach weiter. Okay. Joanna will now turn on the presentation again. And now you can change the slide. So as we're scanning out with ultrasound, there's basically one thing we can do is we can basically adapt the depth all the time. So if we're scanning superficial structures, we don't need 20 centimeters penetration depth. And if we're scanning deep structures, we really need 20 centimeters penetration depth. So it will always be important to actually adapt the penetration depth so you get the best possible picture. And what you're going to do is you center the region of interest. So in that case, it will be your kidneys. And you really try to place it centrally so you can really evaluate it. But I think that's fine now for depth, so we're going to talk about gain. So imagine you're listening to radio, and then there will be this one specific volume you really like to listen to radio to, because you will understand everything, but there will just be no interferences, and it will not be blurred or distorted. And then someone enters the room, and he will turn up the volume. But what happens is that you won't really understand what they're talking about. It will be really, really loud, but you don't get the real message of the picture. So if we are, the same applies basically to sonography. If we are turning up the gain, so the overall brightness of the picture is that we will eventually encounter a picture like that. It will be blurred, it will be distorted, just because the gain is too high. The contrast will be really, really bad. So we have to adjust the gain. And the same thing is if you're listening to the radio and then someone enters the room and he will turn down the volume. what happens is that at one moment you won't be able to get what they're talking about anymore, just because it's too silent. And that's also the reason, or the same applies with gain. If we're putting the gain down too much, we just won't be able to see anything. That's why the right gain, it will be somewhere in between too high gain and too low gain. But really, that's specific and it relies on you. So there are some people who like to listen to music louder and some don't. And so it's up to you how to adjust the gain. And now I want to ask my colleagues Martin and Patrick on stage. We will show you how to move an ultrasound probe, because what's really important is that as we are using an ultrasound transducer, we really have to have a common vocabulary we talk with, because otherwise it will be really, really hard for us to explain, and it will be hard for us to talk about doing ultrasound. So Martin won, and he will actually do the ultrasound examination. What Martin will do is he will apply some jelly on the abdomen of Patrick, so we can reduce the acoustic mismatch between our tissues, and so we can get a good image. He will now acquire a picture of the Morrison pouch, which is, I can't show it, but it's the room between the liver and the kidneys, so you might be able to see. And what the first movement he does is he will slide the probe, so he will just move it to eventually reach the gallbladder. And sliding, it's just a movement of moving the transducer in one row. He will now move to the gallbladder, and he will eventually find the gallbladder. There she is, the anechoic structure. It's a fluid-filled cyst, so it will appear black on the screen. We are seeing the liver next to the gallbladder. And what he will do now is he will rotate the transducers to acquire a short axis view of the gallbladder. Somehow we have lost the gallbladder, I think. But Martin is on his way to look for it. So we are having the gallbladder in a long axis, and we are rotating it to get the gallbladder into a short axis. This will be our second movement. We can not only slide the probe, but we can also rotate the probe. And here we have the gallbladder. Unfortunately, I can't show it in a cross-section. And as we're doing an ultrasound, we want to get really a three-dimensional image of our organ. So the next movement, what Martin will do is he will angulate the probe. So angulating really helps us in changing the angle we will penetrate the tissue. And by angulating the probe, we can get different cross-sections of our organs. And in our minds, we can just create a three-dimensional image of the gallbladder. And as he's now again in a cross-section of the gallbladder. And then there is one last point I want to talk about. It's called heel-toe tilting. So heel-toe tilting is basically lifting off one part of the surface of the transducer. So he will now lift off the first part of the transducer. And now he will move off or lift off the second part of the transducer. And this is really, really helpful if we're having bad acoustic windows, for example, and if you really want to examine a structure in detail. It can be really, really useful to actually have different angles we can scan with. So what we're talking about now is a translational movement. It will be sliding. We can rotate to get from a cross-section to a long axis, or from a long axis to a cross-section. We can angulate our probe, and we can do heel-toe tilting. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much, Patrick. That was it. That were the basics of sonography. I really do hope that you understand quite well now how ultrasound will work, that we will have this emission process of a wave and a reception, that we can display it in an M mode and in a B mode, and that we will have different transducers that we can work with, that we always have to find a compromise between penetration depth and between resolution, and that we have artifacts, but they are no nuisance, but they are rather a diagnostic aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kerstin. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, well,
No, that's okay.
oh, there is a question. Okay.
What are the limitations of ultrasounding in terms of resolution? Like, what's like the smallest object you could picture on that?
That highly depends on the frequency. So
Oh.
the higher the frequency is, the worse will be the resolution. But if you have a 5 megahertz transducer, for example, your resolution will be about 0.3 millimeters.
Cool.
So it's really, really good. But that's only the axial resolution. So the axial resolution is the resolution in the direction of propagation. But then there is also the lateral resolution. So it's the resolution perpendicular to the direction of propagation. And it will be usually 2 to 3 times worse than the axial resolution. So for if we have a really high-end transducer, for example, we might have a resolution of 0.1 millimeters in axial resolution. But in lateral resolution, so perpendicular to it, maybe 3 to 4 millimeters. And then we also have a specific depth of our cross-section. It will be the elevative resolution, and that is not that good. So we're always having not only one beam, but rather, or not only one line, but rather a beam of ultrasound. So that's the main limitation about it.
Okay. And one question more. For beginners, it's often difficult if there is a lot of gas in a bowel. Do you have a tip for beginners how to cope with that?
Yeah, to be honest, bowel gas is a very important limitation if we're doing ultrasound. So if it's not a really emergency situation, you can try to compress the bowel, and what happens is that the bowel might actually change its position. So you might get a good acoustic window, or you might try to move your probe and getting another acoustic window. But to be honest, in my eyes, if we're having a lot of bowel sound and we're in emergency situations, I would rather rely on a computer tomography, because what is really important is that you can actually say, oh, I was not able to find anything or to analyze anything just because the way of examining was limited. And so it's really important to stay true about that. Ultrasound has many limitations we have to face. But still, in an ultrasound situation, most of the times, we won't have to face the problem with bowel gas.
Thank you very much.